Hello Youth Summit. My name's Tim Lenton. I'm from the University of Exeter in the United Kingdom, a beautiful part of the country called Devon. I'm going to speak to you today about the topic you've given me, which is the prospects for negative emissions or carbon dioxide removal or other greenhouse gas removal from the atmosphere. But to start with, I thought we might just quickly review why scientists like myself think we need negative emissions or the ability to take carbon out of the atmosphere. I know your summit is focused on the global challenge of keeping global warming within 2 degrees centigrade of pre-industrial levels, and we're already in a situation where that's going to be an extremely difficult target to meet, as I'm sure you know. So we might begin by just sketching out the problem. We're sat here in 2015, we're looking out to the end of the century, and if we think about the net emissions of, let's say, just carbon dioxide, we're at something like 10 billion tons of carbon per year emissions at the moment, and going upwards at a growth rate of at least 2% per year. But we know to hit the 2 degrees C target, that by 2050 we need something like an 80% reduction in net emissions, so we need to be down at something like 2 billion tons of carbon per year. And then really, in the most realistic scenarios, we need to carry on down and get to a situation in the back half of this century, in your lifetimes I suspect and hope, where we're going to be removing carbon from the atmosphere instead of adding it. Well, we've got a huge challenge. We've got to turn around this current growth of emissions, make a substantive reduction, and then actually get to a situation where we're taking carbon out of the atmosphere. So there's 2 dimensions to this. On the one hand is the conventional idea that yes, we should be reducing our emissions, our combustion of fossil fuels and release of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. But that could only take us down to the 0 line, and that would be phenomenally difficult to do, to remove fossil fuel burning from all sectors of the economy. So if we're going to get down to 0 or go negative, have net removal of carbon, we're going to need to create some carbon sinks, some ways of removing carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Now, nature's doing quite a lot of that for us already. We're emitting these 10 billion tons of carbon per year, but the land and the ocean are both taking up carbon at a rate of about 3 billion tons of carbon per year each. So together they take up a little over half of our emissions. But really here we're going to need to augment that by creating some of our own carbon sinks. So I want to concentrate on how do we do that? Where would these carbon removal processes happen, and what are they? Are they biological, chemical, physical? Now, at the bottom line, plants and algae and what we call cyanobacteria, all the things that photosynthesize on the planet, they're already removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere as an essential part of their metabolism to build their bodies. So perhaps the most logical place to look for ways that we can enhance the carbon sinks and the removal of carbon from the atmosphere is to kind of co-opt photosynthesizers, plants, algae, etc. Have them do the carbon removal for us, for free if you like, and then try and convert some of their biomass that they've created into longer-lived stores of carbon, and try and circumvent the natural processes which would just return that biomass carbon to the atmosphere through respiration, through other organisms eating the plant material. So that is probably the main set of processes, biological routes for carbon removal, that I'll start focusing on, and then I'll talk a little bit about whether we can use chemistry and physics to deliberately get the carbon out of the air and what that would cost. But at the bottom line, trying to come up with some giant chemical engineering route of carbon removal is always going to be more expensive than letting plants or natural photosynthetic processes do the carbon removal for us. So let's think about what's the actual quantitative potential for carbon removal globally? We can think about where we might do this. We might do this on land, or we might do it in the ocean. So we'll just doodle the land surface and the ocean. Now, remembering that just over 70% of the planet is ocean and under 30% is land, you might think that the oceans would be the most sort of promising place to do carbon removal. But that's not really the case. Already in the natural Earth system, as we call it, land productivity, land photosynthesis is more intense, if you like, or effective per unit area than in the oceans. And of course we also live on the land, and we're very used to managing land ecosystems. So in many ways there's a logic to starting on land for carbon removal. I know that you're called plants of the planet, so this is probably a good place to start. I mean, the most obvious thing we might think about for carbon removal is, why don't we just plant more trees? Why don't we try to reverse the historical trend of deforesting the land surface? And indeed, if we could plant forest and do so a forest in a permanent manner, so that we ensured that we kept the carbon locked up in new trees and the soils underneath them, then that would be a net carbon removal route. And we'll have a look in a minute at what's the size of these different options on different timescales, 2050 or 2100. But let's just sketch out a few more of the options, because it turns out that just planting trees and leaving them there isn't the best way to create a carbon sink. Better options could be to take biomass that's part of crops that we might grow for food, but is considered to be the waste part of the crops, and convert those waste parts, the carbon in them, into longer-lived stores. So that could mean taking the biomass carbon, combusting it in some power station, but capturing the carbon dioxide and getting it into the Earth's crust in liquefied form. Or it could mean doing a process which we'd call pyrolysis, where you convert the biomass to charcoal, essentially, or char, and add that potentially back to soils, where it's often referred to as biochar. So that's another route to longer-lived store of carbon. And the thing about harvesting rapidly turning over crops or other plants and continually putting carbon into the ground, if you like, is that you can have a higher productivity system and more carbon removal that way than in a forest, which is great when it's growing quickly, but will eventually sort of saturate in terms of its carbon removal. Here we've just been talking about familiar terrestrial plants, but there's no reason why you can't follow exactly the same logic, but do it with algae. So that could be tiny little microalgae, like the kind of stuff people are thinking about making some sort of second generation biofuels out of, and they might be in lakes or tanks or who knows what on the land surface, or out in the coastal ocean perhaps, or in estuaries if we can manage that kind of situation. Or they might be macroalgae or seaweeds to you and me, including fast-growing seaweeds like kelp forests, out in the shelf seas again, conceivably even in estuary situations. And then the trick would be, well, those guys, those algae, they can take up carbon pretty quickly. Then the challenge becomes, how do we, again, convert the carbon to long-lived form? One way you could do that is to anaerobically break it down, underwater even, have the carbon be turned into methane by natural bacterial processes, capture the methane, combust the methane, capture the carbon dioxide from combustion, and again try and get that back into liquefied CO2 back in geological reserves. Same story potentially for the microalgae, or maybe we'll try and somehow filter the algae out of the water, dry them, turn them into a biofuel, maybe even ferment the fuel, capture the carbon dioxide coming off that. There's a number of lines of attack here, but that gives a rough idea of how we could use photosynthesis as our sort of major route for carbon out of the atmosphere. If we start to try and put some numbers on these different removal processes, I've spent quite a bit of time trying to work out what's the quantitative potential, remembering that our target was to kind of go from a situation with 10 billion tonnes of carbon per year emissions down to some net carbon removal. Well, the emissions component here might come down, but we're still looking for technologies. We're going to need to find technologies that are in the billions of tonnes of carbon per year in terms of removal. So by my estimation, and this depends on some assumptions we can come back to, that afforestation, simply planting trees option, if we start with numbers in, let's look at 2050, maybe we could get somewhere between 0.2 and maybe 1 billion tonnes of carbon per year. So I'm going to write all my numbers in the same units here. If we got up to the 1 billion tonnes of carbon per year, or maybe we could even push that a bit, I reckon my upper limit might be 1.5. That would be like counterbalancing today's net emissions of carbon from land use change. So it's broadly plausible. But if we look at the routes that go via sort of shorter rotating crops, the numbers get bigger. So if we imagine we're kind of diverting biomass from crops and capturing and storing the carbon, I reckon the lower limit may be about 1.25 billion tonnes of carbon per year 2050. Upper limit, we might stretch that towards even 3 billion tonnes of carbon per year in a most optimistic scenario. And then that's starting to look really significant. That's approaching a third of today's emissions. The sort of numbers that you would get there were based on capturing the carbon as CO2 in geological reserves. You could get comparable numbers, I think, diverting to biochar, but you might start to run into a situation where you're sort of filling the world's soils up with charcoal, and mostly people talk about that having benefits for agriculture, but no one's really tested that on such a large scale. If we look at the algae, they have the advantage that they're probably not competing for space with crops and trees. If we're going to be growing algae to do carbon removal, we'll be doing it in existing freshwaters or shelf seas. This is a bit more speculative. I think I was probably one of the first people to even begin to put numbers on this. But when I kind of worked out the potential for the algae, it's a bit sketchy, but I reckon it's somewhere between maybe 0.3 billion tonnes of carbon per year, maybe as high as 1.5. That's really like a combination of both the micro and the macro algae, and considering shelf seas or estuaries as well as fresh waters. So we might ambitiously add all of that up if it weren't competing for the same area. Unfortunately here, the trees or the crops approach, it's not clear whether they're really on separate areas of the land, so it might be cheating to just add all the numbers up. But you can see that even if you maybe didn't sort of double count over here, you could still potentially reach a global number in 2050 of maybe, if we're lucky, something like 3, and if you're really ambitious, maybe up to 5 billion tonnes of carbon per year. That's between about a third and a half of today's emissions. So if at the same time we'd halved the global emissions of carbon and we'd created these sinks, then I reckon we could get the carbon cycle back in balance, and we could get to sort of at least net zero emissions and have the chance of getting net negative in the second half of this century. Now, I mentioned a little bit earlier that these aren't the absolutely only technologies to do this. There's another set of discussions about whether we would ever pay to do kind of chemical and physical ways of getting carbon out of the atmosphere. Sometimes this is referred to as artificial trees. Maybe I can doodle one over here. It's sort of a chemical engineering approach to carbon removal. And there's actually a lot of potential in terms of the carbon flux downwards you could generate through technological means. It's more expensive than all these other options. So it's unlikely to happen until the price of carbon is so high it makes it profitable, and until you've maxed out all these cheaper options. Over in the ocean and also on the land, there's another possibility which is a bit more natural, if you like, and that is to try and enhance processes of weathering rocks that actually are in the Earth's natural system, the natural ways of getting carbon out of the atmosphere. The general problem with those ideas is those natural processes are very slow. They're counterbalancing a small input of carbon dioxide from volcanoes, and to try and ramp them up in speed, we're talking about trying to get things to go orders of magnitude faster and having to mash up massive amounts of what we call alkaline rocks that are of a mass that's greater than the carbon dioxide we're trying to remove. So when you do the numbers for that, you convince yourself that in order to start removing, say, 1 billion tons of carbon per year, I'm going to need to mine, crush, and spread out on the land surface several million tons of, for example, limestone, calcium carbonate. That would be a bigger enterprise by a considerable amount than all the mining activity going on the planet today. So whether that really makes any sense is debatable. Still, even our biological processes alone are giving us some real potential here. And if we carry on extrapolating out to the end of the century, well, those numbers could go up, but it all gets more uncertain. So perhaps now I should turn to the kind of crucial issue here of, do we have the land or the estuary, freshwater space to do all of this? Because I think that's probably the killer issue for negative emissions or carbon removal. What we can't have is a situation where we're in conflict with either protecting natural ecosystems and leaving them some land space, or in conflict with food production, which obviously takes land. So some people have put numbers out in the scientific literature that are quite a lot bigger than my ballpark figures here. But they were based on assumptions where one would be assuming that you were actually implicitly chopping down natural ecosystems in order to try and create more efficient carbon removing artificial ecosystems. I don't think that makes any sense, because we're tackling climate change partly to save ourselves and partly to save natural ecosystems. So why would we deliberately remove natural ecosystems to try and tackle a problem where, in order of climate change, to try and protect them? It's illogical. Food production, well, we've got more than 7 billion people on the planet now, more than 9 billion for sure in 2050, possibly 10, and a double problem that on average, the average citizen on the planet is eating more meat in their diet, and meat is an incredibly inefficient way to feed yourself in terms of the land area it requires. So in other words, we have a global trend where, despite agriculture getting more efficient, these dietary trends mean that there's a huge pressure on trying to produce enough food on the land we have. And it's very, very hard to see how we're not going to have to expand agricultural land in the next 10, 20, 30 years. We might just about do it. We might just about be able to intensify agriculture on current land and feed everybody if we use super efficient systems and do a lot of recycling in agricultural systems. But what that tells us at the bottom line is there's not going to be some magic supply of new land on which we can just choose to plant biofuel crops that we're going to then combust and convert into stored carbon. That just isn't realistic. So in the calculations I've done here, I've modeled this and found that really the major source of carbon that we can lock away in long-lived forms is what we would currently treat as perhaps waste biomass, like the parts of the plant that we don't eat from agricultural systems or the waste from forestry. And the good news is there are already, as these numbers would suggest, billions of tons of carbon per year in the sort of global economy in the form of biomass that we're processing. But we'll often just burn it willy-nilly or return that carbon back to the atmosphere. So I really think the major potential here is in a kind of more efficient and holistic land management, if you like, diverting the existing waste biomass flows into long-lived stores of carbon. And when we do that, being very careful that we don't accidentally lock away essential nutrients, for example, in the Earth's crust, when we need to return those to the ecosystems and the agricultural systems to keep growth levels high. Well, that's a kind of a swift and broad overview, but I hope it gives some encouragement that there could be the potential for really significant global carbon removal, and a possibility that if we combine really wide scale, what I would call aggressive mitigation, aggressive reduction in fossil fuel consumption and carbon emissions, with this largely land and biological based deliberate carbon removal, then we really could, if we went for it on the global scale, end up in the back end of this century being able to cut out carbon emissions and even go to net negative emissions. But there's no pretending that that would be easy, or that it wouldn't be a massive global scale enterprise of the same sort of scale and effort as global agriculture and indeed the global fossil fuel extraction and mining industries. So whatever we do, we're looking at a future here which is quite technological, demands really strict adherence to principles of recycling in a global sense of carbon, but also thinking about other nutrients, etc. And being super efficient in meeting our rising demands for sort of food energy, as well as our presumed rising demands for energy to enable everyone to develop. And perhaps the good news story in this is many of these biomass pathways for carbon removal, you don't have to. You can also get energy on the way. You don't have to sacrifice the fact that there's energy locked up in the biomass. When you combust it and then capture the carbon for storage, you're still getting some net energy release that can play some part in kind of meeting future energy demand, along with, I suspect, a major part from renewables and especially solar energy. So with that, I'm not too disheartened. I think it's an enormous challenge, but we could meet the 2 degree C target, but we need to get serious globally now and be aggressively developing these technologies, because right now they're largely unproven. They're at a very early stage of what we might call technological readiness, and without a massive research and development program, there's really no hope of getting to the kind of numbers I've talked about. So with your support and enthusiasm and lobbying of our elected representatives, I hope together we're going to help tackle this profound problem of global climate change, and we'll enjoy hopefully a cooler and happier future because of it. Thanks very much.